Some people wear masks so convincingly that when they finally slip, you question your entire reality. You wonder how you missed the signs, how you trusted so completely, how you let someone into the most intimate corners of your family while they quietly sharpened a knife behind their back. My mother-in-law was that person. For 9 years, Patricia Thornton played the role of the perfect grandmother, the devoted mother-in-law, the elegant widow who had gracefully accepted me into her family. And I believed every single moment of it. I defended her to friends who raised eyebrows at her involvement in our lives. I praised her to David when he occasionally seemed frustrated with her hovering. I genuinely loved her, or at least I loved the woman I thought she was. Then I found her journal, and every memory I had of her transformed into something dark and calculated and terrifying. What I discovered in those handwritten pages would have broken most people. It nearly broke me. But instead of crumbling, I made a choice. I decided that Patricia Thornton would face the consequences of her deception, and I would be the one to deliver them. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, because you need to understand how deeply her manipulation ran, how long she had been playing this game while I remained completely oblivious. I met David Thornton at a charity fundraiser in London when I was 24 years old. I was working as an assistant event coordinator, barely scraping by, still carrying the weight of having lost both my parents by the time I was 19. My mother died of cancer when I was 16, and my father followed 3 years later from a heart attack that the doctors said was stress-related, but that I always believed was from a broken heart. I had no siblings, no extended family to speak of, and I had built my life from nothing through sheer determination and an unwillingness to let my circumstances define me. David was different from anyone I had ever met. He came from money, old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. His father had passed away when David was in his late 20s, leaving Patricia a wealthy widow and David the heir to a modest fortune that he had grown substantially through his own work as a corporate attorney. But despite his background, David was kind and genuine and seemed completely unaffected by the privilege he had been born into. He found me refilling champagne glasses at that fundraiser and struck up a conversation that lasted until the venue staff started stacking chairs around us. 6 months later, we were engaged. A year after that, we were married in a beautiful ceremony at his family's country estate in the Cotswolds. Patricia was perfect from the very beginning, and I mean that in the most unsettling way possible, now that I understand what she truly is. When David first introduced me to her, she embraced me warmly and told me that any woman who had captured her son's heart so completely must be extraordinary. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, my interests, my dreams. She expressed genuine sympathy when she learned about my parents, and she told me that she would be honored to be whatever family I needed her to be. I remember crying in the car on the way home from that first meeting, telling David how lucky I felt to be gaining not just a husband but a mother figure who seemed to genuinely care about me. He squeezed my hand and said his mother had always had a gift for making people feel welcome. I had no idea how prophetic and how ironic those words would become. The first years of our marriage were genuinely happy, or so I believed. Patricia was a constant presence, but never in a way that felt intrusive. She would stop by with homemade meals when I was tired from work. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every small milestone with thoughtful gifts and handwritten cards. When I got pregnant with Sophie, Patricia was the first person I told after David, and she wept with joy and immediately began planning how she would help us. She converted one of the guest rooms in her home into a nursery so we could visit comfortably. She took infant care classes at 60 years old so she would be prepared. She was, by every external measure, the mother-in-law that most women dream of having. Sophie was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, and Patricia was at the hospital within an hour, holding her granddaughter with tears streaming down her face. I remember watching her in that moment and feeling such profound gratitude that my children would have a grandmother who loved them so completely. My own mother never got to meet my babies, and that loss was something I carried with me constantly. Patricia seemed to understand that wound without me ever having to explain it, and she stepped into that role with what appeared to be genuine love and dedication. When James came along 3 years later, she was equally devoted, splitting her attention between both grandchildren with practiced ease. She babysat whenever we needed her. She picked Sophie up from school when our schedules got complicated. She took the children on special grandmother outings to museums and parks and tea rooms where Sophie could feel like a princess. Our children adored her, and I encouraged that bond because I believed it was healthy and beautiful and everything a family should be. The first hint that something was wrong came when Sophie was 5 years old, though I did not recognize it for what it was at the time. We had been having a particularly difficult week. David was working long hours on a demanding case. I had recently been passed over for a promotion at my marketing firm, and both children had been cycling through various minor illnesses that kept us all exhausted. Patricia had been helping, more than usual, picking up slack wherever she could, and I was genuinely grateful. But one evening, as I was putting Sophie to bed, she said something that lodged itself in my memory like a splinter I could not remove. She looked up at me with her serious little face and said, "Mummy, Grandma says you get tired a lot because you did not grow up with proper help like Daddy did. She says it is not your fault that you do not know how to manage a big house." I remember freezing, my hand still on her blanket, trying to process what my 5-year-old had just repeated. I asked Sophie what else Grandma had said, keeping my voice light and curious, and Sophie shrugged and said, "Grandma talks about lots of things but told her not to repeat them because they might hurt Mummy's feelings." I told myself it was nothing. Children misunderstand adult conversations constantly, and Patricia had never been anything but supportive to my face. I mentioned it to David that night in a joking way, and he laughed and said his mother probably just meant that I worked harder than most because I had achieved everything myself, that she admired my independence. I accepted that explanation because it was easier than the alternative, because I could not imagine the woman who had embraced me so warmly being anything other than genuine. But the splinter remained, and over the following months I started noticing other small things that I had previously dismissed or explained away. There was the time Patricia suggested very gently that perhaps I was feeding James too many processed foods because his skin seemed a bit splotchy. There was her habit of rearranging my kitchen cabinets when she visited because apparently my organization system was inefficient. There was the way she would sometimes look at me when I disciplined the children. A quick flash of disapproval that vanished so fast I was never certain I had actually seen it. There was her tendency to buy Sophie clothes that were beautiful but several sizes too small, then act confused when they did not fit, saying she could have sworn Sophie was more petite. There was the Christmas when she gave me an expensive gym membership with a note saying she wanted to support my health journey, even though I had never expressed any desire to lose weight or change my appearance. Each incident was minor on its own, easily explained, easily dismissed. But they accumulated in my subconscious like drops of water wearing away at stone. The real trouble began 2 years ago, though I did not connect the dots until much later. David started coming home tense and distracted, withdrawing into his phone and his work in ways that felt new and concerning. When I asked what was wrong, he would say it was just stress from the firm, but the distance between us grew in increments that were impossible to ignore. Around the same time, Sophie started having behavioral issues at school, acting out in class and coming home with notes from teachers expressing concern. James, usually the most easygoing child, became clingy and anxious, crying whenever I left for work. The pediatrician suggested it might be a phase, developmental growing pains that many children experience. But I felt in my bones that something else was happening, some undercurrent I could not identify. Patricia, as always, was there to help. She increased her visits, offered to take the children more often to give David and me time to work on our marriage. She suggested couples counseling with a therapist she knew, a woman she said had helped many families in crisis. She brought over articles about communication in marriage and left them casually on our coffee table. She was so helpful, so concerned, so present, and I remained so blind. The discovery happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in September, and it changed everything. Patricia had offered to watch the children while David was at work, and I attended a conference for my job. The conference ended early when one of the speakers fell ill, and I came home around 2 in the afternoon instead of the expected 5. Patricia's car was in the driveway, but the house was strangely quiet when I entered. I found her in my bedroom, which was unusual enough to register immediate alarm. She was standing near my dresser, and she startled visibly when she saw me, her hand moving quickly away from the drawer she had been examining. Her recovery was smooth, practiced. She smiled and said she had been looking for a hair tie for Sophie, whose ponytail had come undone. She asked about the conference, commenting that I was home early, her tone light but her eyes watchful. I accepted her explanation in the moment because I had no reason not to, but something about her demeanor stayed with me. That night, after the children were in bed and David was working late, again, I searched my dresser carefully. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed or missing, but I could not shake the feeling that I had interrupted something. I started paying closer attention to Patricia's visits after that, watching her more carefully when she was in our home. I noticed that she seemed particularly interested in my office space, in the files I kept for work, in my laptop when it was left unattended. I noticed that she asked subtle questions about our finances, about David's cases, about my job security in ways that felt like more than casual conversation. 2 months later, I found the journal. We had gone to Patricia's home for Sunday lunch, a regular tradition that I had always enjoyed. The children were playing in the garden with David while Patricia and I cleaned up in the kitchen. She asked me to fetch a serving dish from the storage room at the end of the hallway, a room I had been in only a handful of times. I found the dish easily enough, but as I was leaving, I noticed a box on one of the shelves that was slightly open, revealing what looked like leather-bound notebooks inside. Curiosity is a strange thing. There was no logical reason for me to look inside that box, no justification for what I did next, but something compelled me, some instinct that had been building for years without my conscious awareness. I lifted the lid and saw a stack of identical journals, at least a dozen of them, all with dates written on the spines in Patricia's elegant handwriting. The topmost one covered the current year. I should have put it back. I should have respected her privacy and walked away. But I did not. I opened the journal to a random page, and the first sentence I read felt like a physical blow. Emma looked particularly haggard today. I do not understand why David cannot see how far beneath him she is, but patience is essential. The children are nearly old enough now. I stood frozen in that storage room, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain someone would hear it. I flipped to another page, spoke with Sophie again today about how different things were when her father was young, how calm and orderly our home was, how Mummy and Daddy never raised their voices, how there was always time for bedtime stories and proper meals. She is such a perceptive child. She notices more than Emma gives her credit for. I am planting seeds. They will bloom eventually. I turned more pages, my horror growing with each entry. David called, upset about an argument with Emma. I listened sympathetically and reminded him that his father and I never fought like that a peaceful home is possible with the right partner. He said perhaps he married too young. The guilt was evident in his voice, which is encouraging. He is beginning to see the truth. And further, suggested to James that sometimes mummies get too tired to play because they have to work too much. He cried and asked if Grandma would play with him instead. I held him and told him I would always be here for him, that Grandma would never be too busy for her special boy. Emma will never know these conversations happen. She trusts me completely. I do not know how long I stood there reading. Time became meaningless as I absorbed page after page of Patricia's meticulous documentation of her campaign against me. The journal was not merely a record of her feelings, it was an operational manual. She had been systematically undermining my relationships with my children for years, having subtle conversations designed to make them feel that I was inadequate, too busy, too tired, too different from the warmth and stability she represented. She had been feeding David carefully selected observations about our marriage, highlighting every conflict, every moment of tension, every normal difficulty of family life as evidence that he had made a mistake. She had been building a case methodically and deliberately for something she referred to repeatedly as the eventual outcome. The journal entries made her intentions horrifyingly clear. Patricia did not simply dislike me. She was working toward removing me from my own family. She had consulted with attorneys discreetly about grandparent custody rights. She had been documenting every time I raised my voice at the children, every time I was late picking them up, every time I seemed stressed or overwhelmed, framing these normal parenting moments as evidence of instability. She had kept records of my family medical history, noting that both my parents had died young, as if this were somehow a character flaw rather than a tragedy. She had even written about monitoring my social media accounts for anything that might be useful. But the most devastating entries were the ones about my career. 2 years ago, I had been in contention for a significant promotion at my marketing firm. I had made it to the final round of candidates and felt confident about my chances. At the last moment, the position went to someone else, and I was told only that the other candidate had been a better fit. I had been disappointed, but had moved on. Now I understood what had really happened. Patricia had written about it in detail. She had a friend whose husband sat on the board of my company. She had arranged a lunch, had expressed concern about my mental health, about the strain I was under with young children and a demanding husband. She had mentioned, so casually, that I had been considering leaving the workforce to focus on family anyway, that the promotion might actually make things worse for me. She had sabotaged me, deliberately and systematically, because she wanted me dependent and vulnerable. I heard footsteps in the hallway and shoved the journal back into the box, closing the lid just as Patricia appeared in the doorway. "Did you find the dish?" she asked, and I held it up with hands I barely managed to keep steady. She smiled, that warm, grandmotherly smile I had trusted for so many years, and I smiled back, and neither of us acknowledged the war that had just been declared. The drive home from Patricia's house that evening was the longest journey of my life. David drove while Sophie chattered about the butterflies she had seen in Grandma's garden, and James dozed in his car seat. I sat in the passenger seat and said nothing, staring out the window at the passing countryside while my mind raced through every interaction I had ever had with my mother-in-law, re-examining each moment through the lens of what I now knew. Every kindness had been calculated. Every gesture of support had been designed to position herself closer to my children. Every sympathetic ear she had offered my husband had been part of a campaign to convince him he had married the wrong woman. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake for hours making a decision. My first instinct was to confront her, to throw her words back in her face and demand she explain herself. My second instinct was to tell David immediately, to show him the evidence and let him deal with his mother. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized that neither approach would work. Patricia had been building her case for nearly a decade. She had documentation, connections, and the accumulated weight of years of careful manipulation. If I confronted her without preparation, she would deny everything and claim I was unstable, perhaps even use my accusation as further evidence against me. If I went to David too quickly, before I fully understood what I was dealing with, he might not believe me. He had spent 37 years being trained to trust and defend his mother. One journal entry would not undo a lifetime of conditioning. No, if I was going to protect my family and expose Patricia for what she truly was, I needed to be strategic. I needed to build my own case, gather my own evidence, understand the full scope of her scheming before I made a single move. I needed to beat her at her own game. The following weeks were among the most difficult of my life. I had to pretend that nothing had changed, had to smile at Patricia across dinner tables and thank her for her help with the children while knowing exactly what she thought of me and what she was planning. But beneath that facade of normalcy, I was working. I returned to Patricia's house whenever I could find an excuse, always managing to slip away for a few minutes to photograph pages from her journals. There were 12 volumes spanning nearly our entire marriage, and each one contained fresh horrors. I learned that she had invited her friends over specifically to observe me, then recorded their impressions in her journals. I learned that she had deliberately scheduled activities for the children during times when she knew I would be busy, so she could later mention to David how disappointing it was that I had missed another of Sophie's accomplishments. I learned that she had been putting money aside in a separate account for years, earmarked for legal fees when the time came. But I also discovered something else in those journals, something she clearly had not anticipated anyone ever reading. Patricia's hatred of me was not personal, or rather, it was not about me specifically. The journals revealed that she had torpedoed David's previous serious relationship as well, a woman named Claire, whom he had dated in his mid-20s. Claire had been the daughter of a prominent surgeon, socially suitable by any measure, but Patricia had found her wanting anyway. The journal entries from that period were thinner, but followed the same pattern. Subtle undermining, strategic conversations with David about Claire's flaws, manufactured conflicts. Claire had eventually ended the relationship, citing David's unhealthy attachment to his mother, and Patricia had written about her victory with undisguised satisfaction. I was not Patricia's first target. I was simply her latest. This revelation changed how I understood her. She was not a mother-in-law who disliked her son's wife. She was a woman so obsessed with control over her son that she could not tolerate any other woman having a claim on his love and loyalty. Her goal was not specifically to destroy me. Her goal was to ensure that David never truly belonged to anyone but her. The children were part of this too. She wanted to be their primary maternal figure, to raise them as she had raised David, to maintain her grip on the Thornton family across generations. Understanding this made my task both easier and harder. Easier because Patricia's pattern of behavior meant that others might corroborate my evidence. Harder because I now understood just how deep her dysfunction ran and how fiercely she would fight to protect herself. I started keeping my own records, but carefully, in ways that could not be easily discovered or dismissed. I installed a nanny camera in our living room that captured audio as well as video. Over the following months, this camera recorded several conversations between Patricia and the children that perfectly matched what she had described in her journals. I watched footage of her telling Sophie that Daddy seemed sad lately, and asking if Sophie knew why, leading my 7-year-old to offer that Mummy and Daddy sometimes argued about money. I watched her tell James that he could always come stay with Grandma if home got too loud, planting the idea that our home was somehow chaotic or unsafe. I watched her systematically poison my children against me in small, deniable increments while presenting herself as their safe harbor. I also began repairing the damage she had done to my career. The friend whose husband sat on my company's board was a woman named Georgina, someone I had met at Patricia's parties and always found vaguely cold toward me. I cultivated a connection with her, casually, carefully, until one afternoon over tea she mentioned that she had felt terrible about what Patricia had told her before my promotion. She had repeated Patricia's concerns to her husband out of genuine worry for my well-being, not realizing she was being used. When I gently corrected the record, explaining that I had never considered leaving my job and had been devastated to miss that promotion, Georgina's face went pale. She apologized profusely. And then she told me something that proved even more valuable. Patricia had been spreading similar rumors about me throughout their social circle for years. She had told people I had postpartum depression that I refused to treat. She had implied that David stayed with me out of obligation to the children. She had suggested that I came from a family with a history of mental illness, which was why both my parents died young. These were lies, vicious, calculated lies designed to establish a narrative about me that would support whatever she eventually tried to do. But Patricia had made a mistake. She had told these lies to women who were now, because of various social shifts and fallings out, less loyal to her than they once had been. Georgina was not the only one willing to talk once I started asking careful questions. By spring, I had assembled a substantial collection of evidence. I had photographs of journal entries spanning 8 years. I had video footage of Patricia manipulating my children. I had written statements from 3 women who had heard Patricia spread false information about my mental health and family history. I had documentation from my company's HR department confirming that concerns had been raised about my stability prior to my failed promotion, concerns that traced directly back to Patricia's interference. I had financial records showing that Patricia had been moving money into accounts specifically designated for potential custody litigation. And I had found, after a great deal of digging, contact information for Claire, David's former girlfriend. Claire was initially reluctant to speak with me. She had moved on with her life, was married with children of her own now, and had no desire to revisit the painful end of her relationship with David. But when I explained what I had discovered, when I told her about the journals and the patterns I had identified, she agreed to meet me. What she told me over coffee one rainy afternoon was the final piece I needed. Claire confirmed that Patricia had systematically destroyed their relationship over an 18-month period using techniques nearly identical to what I had experienced. She had planted doubts in David's mind about Claire's commitment. She had manufactured situations where Claire appeared selfish or inconsiderate. She had told Claire directly, in a moment of unusual honesty, that no woman would ever be good enough for her son, and that Claire should accept that David would always put his mother first. Claire had eventually left, not because she stopped loving David, but because she could not compete with Patricia's influence over him. She had warned David on her way out that his mother's behavior was unhealthy and that he would never have a successful relationship until he addressed it. David had dismissed her concerns as jealousy and bitterness. I asked Claire if she would be willing to provide a written statement about her experience. She hesitated for a long moment. Then she said yes. She said that she had carried guilt for years about not fighting harder, about not finding a way to make David see the truth. If her statement could help protect my children and my marriage, she wanted to contribute. I now had everything I needed. The question was how to use it. Confronting Patricia directly remained a tempting option, but I had thought through the scenarios carefully. If I accused her privately, she would deny everything and immediately begin damage control, warning David that I was becoming paranoid and unstable, exactly as her journal suggested she had planned. If I involved lawyers immediately, it would become adversarial in ways that might push David further toward his mother's influence. I needed an approach that would expose Patricia completely while giving David the space to process what he was learning without feeling attacked. I decided to start with David, but not with accusations. Instead, I began with questions. One evening after the children were asleep, I sat David down and told him I had been feeling disconnected from him lately. I asked if he felt the same. He admitted that he did, that something had shifted in our relationship over the past few years, though he could not identify what. I asked if his mother had ever expressed concerns about our marriage, and he stiffened slightly before acknowledging that she had. She worried about us, he said. She wanted us to be happy. I nodded and said I appreciated her concern. Then I asked very carefully if he ever felt that his mother's involvement in our lives might be more than typical for a grandmother. I said I was not accusing anyone of anything, just trying to understand our family dynamics better. David was defensive at first, as I expected. His mother loved us. His mother had done nothing but support our family. His mother was the most generous person he knew. I did not argue. I simply said that I had been doing some reflecting on my own family history, on losing my parents so young, and I was realizing that I might not have the best frame of reference for what normal extended family relationships look like. I asked David if he would be open to going to therapy with me, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted us to be as strong as possible for Sophie and James. He agreed somewhat reluctantly, but he agreed. The therapist I chose was not the one Patricia had recommended. I had researched that woman and discovered she was a longtime friend of Patricia's from her charity committee work, which explained why Patricia had suggested her so readily. Instead, I found a family therapist with excellent credentials and no connection to my mother-in-law whatsoever. The first few sessions focused on communication between David and me, on establishing trust and openness in our conversations. But gradually, with the therapist's guidance, we began exploring our broader family dynamics. I shared my feelings of inadequacy around Patricia's perfectionism, framing it as my own insecurity rather than an accusation. I mentioned specific instances where I had felt subtly criticized and asked David for his perspective. To my surprise and encouragement, he acknowledged that his mother could be particular about things and that he had sometimes felt caught between us even when no obvious conflict existed. Week by week, the therapy chipped away at the fortress Patricia had built around David's perceptions. He started noticing things on his own. He observed his mother making a pointed comment about my housekeeping and asked her, for perhaps the first time in his life, to keep such opinions to herself. He caught her telling Sophie that Daddy worked very hard and asking if Mummy appreciated that, and he confronted her after the children were out of earshot. She laughed it off, claimed she was joking, but David told me about the incident that night with a troubled expression. The foundation was cracking. It was time to bring out the evidence. I chose a weekend when the children were away at a friend's birthday party sleepover. I sat David down in our living room and told him I needed to share something with him. Something that would be painful, but that he needed to see. I showed him first the videos from the nanny camera. He watched his mother manipulating his children with his face growing progressively more pale, his hands gripping the armrest of the sofa. When the videos ended, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Perhaps she did not mean it the way it sounds." I understood his denial. It was easier than accepting that his mother, the woman who had raised him, was capable of such calculated cruelty. So I showed him more. I showed him photographs of the journal entries, dozens of them, documenting Patricia's campaign against me in her own handwriting. I showed him the entries about sabotaging my career. I showed him the entries about building a custody case. I showed him the entries where she described him as easily influenced and wrote about techniques for steering his opinions without him realizing it. David read in silence. When he finally looked up, there were tears on his face. He asked how long this had been going on. I told him nearly our entire marriage. He asked why I had not come to him sooner. I explained that I had only discovered the journals recently and that I had needed time to understand the full scope of what was happening before I said anything. He asked if his mother had really done all of this, and his voice broke on the question. I showed him Claire's statement. That, I think, was what finally shattered his resistance. Learning that Patricia had destroyed his previous relationship, using the same methods she was now using against me. Learning that her behavior was a pattern rather than a situation specific to me, forced David to confront a truth he had been avoiding his entire adult life. His mother did not just love him, his mother was obsessed with controlling him. And that obsession had cost him Claire, had nearly cost him me, and would eventually cost him his children if she succeeded in her plans. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. David cycled through denial, anger, grief, and guilt in waves that left us both exhausted. He apologized for not seeing what was happening. He apologized for the times he had dismissed my concerns. He apologized for being, as he put it, the weapon she used against his own family. I told him he was not responsible for his mother's choices, that her manipulation had been designed specifically to keep him blind, and that what mattered now was what we did together going forward. We decided not to confront Patricia immediately. Instead, we consulted with a lawyer, a colleague of David's whom he trusted completely, to understand our options. The lawyer reviewed my evidence and confirmed that while Patricia's behavior was deeply disturbing, she had not technically committed any crimes. However, he noted that her documented plans to pursue custody, combined with evidence of her attempting to alienate the children from their mother, would be extremely damaging to any future custody claims she might make. He advised us to continue documenting, to establish clear boundaries, and to prepare for the possibility that Patricia would escalate when she realized she was losing control. What happened next was something none of us anticipated. Patricia had a close friend named Margaret, a woman she had known since childhood and trusted implicitly. What Patricia did not know was that Margaret had grown increasingly uncomfortable with some of the things Patricia had shared with her over the years, confidences that suggested Patricia's attitude toward me was more hostile than she ever let on publicly. When Margaret heard through the social grapevine that David and I were suddenly spending less time with Patricia, she reached out to me directly. The conversation was illuminating. Margaret told me that Patricia had been confiding in her about her plans for years, framing them as concerns about her grandchildren's welfare rather than a vendetta against me. But recently, Margaret said, something had shifted. Patricia had become more aggressive in her language, more explicit about her intentions. She had told Margaret just the previous week that she was tired of waiting, that it was time to make things happen, and that she had assembled enough evidence to approach a lawyer about emergency custody. I asked Margaret what evidence Patricia believed she had. Margaret said Patricia had documented instances of me losing my temper with the children, had medical records she had somehow obtained suggesting I had sought treatment for anxiety, and had statements from several mothers at Sophie's school who had witnessed me looking overwhelmed at various events. She also had, Margaret said hesitantly, photographs of the interior of our home taken during visits that showed clutter and disorganization. I realized with a chill that Patricia had been building her case even as I had been building mine. The journal entries I had found were only part of her operation. She had been gathering evidence from multiple sources, preparing for a custody battle she intended to initiate. David and I moved quickly after learning this. Our lawyer drafted a formal letter to Patricia informing her that we were aware of her activities and that any attempt to pursue custody of our children would be met with legal action. The letter did not specify what evidence we had, only that it was substantial and documented her pattern of behavior over many years. The letter also informed her that she was no longer welcome in our home and that any contact with Sophie and James would occur only under supervised conditions until further notice. Patricia's response was immediate and exactly as we had predicted. She called David crying, claiming she had no idea what we were talking about, insisting that someone had poisoned us against her. When David remained firm, her tone shifted. She became cold and threatened. She said she had resources and connections and that we had no idea what we were starting. She said she would see us in court if that was how we wanted to handle this, and she hung up. 3 days later, we were served with papers. Patricia was indeed filing for grandparent visitation rights, claiming that we were attempting to alienate her from her grandchildren without cause. The filing painted her as a devoted grandmother, being unfairly cut off from the grandchildren she loved, and it painted me as an unstable mother who was manipulating my husband against his own family. What Patricia did not know was that we had been prepared for exactly this move. Our lawyer filed a response that included selected evidence from my collection, enough to demonstrate that Patricia's claims of being a devoted grandmother were contradicted by her own documented words. We submitted journal entries where she discussed her custody plans. We submitted video footage of her manipulating the children. We submitted statements from Georgina and the other women who had heard Patricia spread lies about me. And we submitted Claire's statement, establishing that Patricia's behavior was a pattern that predated my existence in David's life. The family court judge reviewed the materials in chambers before the first hearing. When we arrived for what Patricia clearly expected to be a sympathetic session about her visitation rights, the atmosphere in the courtroom was noticeably different than she had anticipated. The judge addressed Patricia directly and asked her to explain certain passages from her journals. Patricia stammered that the journals had been taken out of context, that they were private reflections, never meant to be seen by others. The judge asked if she denied writing those words. Patricia said no, but that the meaning had been distorted. The judge then played a portion of the video footage in which Patricia was speaking to Sophie about how tired Mummy always seemed and asking if Sophie ever wished she could live with Grandma instead. Patricia watched herself on the screen with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of shock and fury that someone had captured her in a moment she believed was private. The judge denied Patricia's petition for visitation. More than that, the judge expressed serious concern about Patricia's conduct and suggested that continuing contact between her and the children might not be in their best interest. The judge also noted that several elements of Patricia's filing appeared to contain misleading or false statements, and that there could be consequences for attempting to manipulate the court. Patricia's lawyer requested a recess to confer with his client. When they returned, Patricia was pale and silent. Her lawyer announced that she was withdrawing her petition. But I was not finished. Over the following weeks, I made sure that Patricia's social circle learned the truth about her behavior. I did not have to spread gossip myself. Margaret, freed from her conflicted loyalty by Patricia's exposure in court, told their mutual friends what she knew. Georgina shared the story of how Patricia had used her to sabotage my career. Claire wrote a blog post about her experience that did not name Patricia directly, but that anyone who knew the situation could immediately identify. The carefully constructed image Patricia had maintained for decades began to unravel as person after person realized that the elegant widow they had admired was something far darker beneath the surface. Patricia's social standing, which she had spent her entire life cultivating, collapsed. She was quietly dropped from charity boards. Old friends stopped returning her calls. The invitations to garden parties and luncheons that had once filled her calendar dried up completely. She was, in the most meaningful way possible for someone of her values and priorities, ruined. David struggled with the aftermath. Patricia was still his mother, and despite everything, he loved her. He attempted one final conversation with her several months after the court case, hoping that perhaps she had reflected on her behavior and was ready to acknowledge what she had done. Instead, she blamed me for everything. She said I had turned her son against her. She said I had stolen her grandchildren. She said she had only ever wanted what was best for her family and that I had destroyed everything. David left that meeting understanding, finally, that his mother was not capable of the self-reflection necessary for any kind of reconciliation. We moved the following year, not far, but far enough that accidental encounters were unlikely. Sophie and James were confused at first about why they no longer saw Grandma, and we explained in age-appropriate terms that Grandma had made some choices that were not healthy for our family. Sophie, who was old enough to remember some of the conversations Patricia had with her, nodded slowly and said she had sometimes felt weird after talking to Grandma. Like Grandma wanted her to feel bad about Mummy. I held my daughter and told her she had done nothing wrong, that Grandma's behavior was not her fault, and that we would always protect her. The healing took time. David worked with a therapist of his own to process his childhood and his relationship with his mother, to understand how her control had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to recognize. Our marriage, which Patricia had worked so hard to destroy, grew stronger. The distance from her influence allowed us to find each other again, to rebuild trust that had been eroded so gradually we had not noticed until it was nearly gone. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I had never found those journals. Patricia's plan was meticulous and patient. She might have eventually convinced David to leave me. She might have gained the access to my children she craved. She might have raised them the way she raised David, teaching them to prioritize her needs above all else, continuing her pattern of control into another generation. The thought makes me cold in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. But I did find the journals, and I did fight back, and I won. The last I heard of Patricia, she had moved to a smaller property in a different county, away from the community that had rejected her. She has made no further attempts to contact us. David receives occasional messages from distant relatives who think he should reconcile with his mother, who believe that family should stay together no matter what. He does not respond to these messages. He has finally understood what it took me years of suffering to realize. Some people wear masks so convincingly that you forget to look beneath them. Some people use love as a weapon rather than a gift. And some relationships, even those bound by blood and marriage, are too toxic to survive. I used to believe that family meant unconditional acceptance, that the people closest to you would always have your best interests at heart. I was an orphan who built a family from nothing, and I treasured every connection, because I knew how easily they could be lost. Patricia exploited that vulnerability. She saw my desire for belonging and used it against me, presenting herself as the mother I had lost while secretly working to take everything from me. But she underestimated me. She saw my background as evidence of weakness, proof that I lacked the resources and connections to challenge her. She did not understand that growing up without safety nets teaches you to be resourceful, to watch carefully, to trust your instincts even when everyone around you insists nothing is wrong. She thought her journals were safely hidden, her mask securely in place. She never imagined that the daughter-in-law she dismissed as beneath her son would be the one to bring her carefully constructed world crashing down. My children are thriving now. Sophie is 10. Fiercely independent and endlessly curious. James is 7, still the most joyful person I know. They do not ask about Patricia often, and when they do, we answer honestly, without dwelling on details too heavy for their ears. They know that Grandma made mistakes and that sometimes people who seem to love you have other motivations. We are teaching them, in ways large and small, to trust themselves, to notice when something feels wrong, to know that they can always come to us with concerns. David is a different husband than he was before. He is present in ways he was not capable of when his mother's voice was constantly in his ear, second-guessing our relationship, undermining our foundation. He has apologized more times than I can count for not seeing the truth sooner, and I have told him each time that he was a victim too, that Patricia's manipulation of him began in childhood and continued throughout his adult life. We are both survivors of her, and we have found our way forward together. Some nights, when the house is quiet and I am lying in bed watching David sleep peacefully beside me, I think about the moment I opened that journal in Patricia's storage room. I think about how close I came to, never looking, to walking away with the serving dish and returning to my life of blind trust. If I had made a different choice in that single moment, everything would be different now. Patricia might have won. But I did look. I saw the truth she had hidden for so long. And I protected my family from the enemy wearing a grandmother's smile. That is my story. That is my confession. I am not proud of everything I did, the sneaking and the photographing and the careful manipulation of circumstances to expose Patricia. But I am proud of my children's safety. I am proud of my marriage. I am proud of the life we have built in the wreckage of her schemes. Patricia wanted to be the victim of this story. She wanted to be the devoted grandmother unfairly cut off from the grandchildren she adored. She wanted the world to see me as the unstable interloper who poisoned her son against his own family. Instead, the world saw the truth. And truth, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. I do not know if Patricia will ever truly understand what she did to us. I suspect she remains convinced that she was right, that her actions were justified, that we overreacted to behavior that was simply a grandmother's love taken slightly too far. People like her rarely have the capacity for genuine self-reflection. They build narratives in which they are always the heroes, always the victims, never the architects of their own destruction. But her story no longer intersects with mine. The journal I found revealed not just her plans but her essence, the cold calculation beneath the warm facade, the obsession beneath the devotion. I took that knowledge and used it to protect everything I love. If you are listening to this and you recognize something familiar in Patricia's behavior, if someone in your life wears a mask that slips just slightly when they think no one is watching, trust your instincts. Pay attention to the splinters that lodge in your memory, the small comments that do not quite fit, the moments when someone's helpfulness feels more like surveillance. The people who are truly on your side do not need to undermine you to prove their love. I was lucky. I found the evidence I needed in time. Not everyone is so fortunate. But if you are in that situation, know that you are not imagining things. Know that your discomfort is valid. Know that you deserve relationships that lift you up rather than systematically tear you down while pretending to support you. And know that even the most careful masks eventually slip. When they do, be ready. I was ready. And now I am free.